In the heart of a sprawling metropolis, where glass skyscrapers pierced the clouds and ambition pulsed through the streets, lived a man named Victor Langston. Victor was a titan of industry, the CEO of Langston Enterprises, a conglomerate that dominated everything from tech to real estate. At 42, he was a figure of calculated charm, with sharp features and a smile that could disarm or destroy depending on his mood. His life was a carefully curated empire, built on relentless drive and a knack for bending the world to his will. But beneath the polished exterior of his tailored suits and corner office, a storm was brewing, one that would unravel his world in ways he never anticipated. Victor's wife, Eleanor, was 34, radiant even in her 7th month of pregnancy. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves, framing a face that held both strength and vulnerability. She had been a marketing executive before marrying Victor, her career sidelined to support his ascent. Their marriage, once a partnership of mutual ambition, had frayed over the years. Victor's late nights at the office, his dismissive tone, and his growing obsession with control had chipped away at the love they once shared. Yet Eleanor clung to hope, believing the arrival of their child, a son, they'd learned, would mend the cracks in their relationship. She poured her energy into preparing for motherhood, decorating a nursery with soft blues and tiny stars, her hands often resting on her belly as she whispered promises to the life growing inside her. But Victor's heart had wandered. His mistress, Cassandra, was a 26-year-old model with a penchant for designer clothes and a smile that could stop traffic. She was everything Eleanor wasn't, unencumbered, glamorous, and wholly devoted to Victor's ego. Their affair had begun in secret, tucked away in penthouse suites and late-night texts, but Victor's arrogance made him careless. He stopped hiding Cassandra, parading her at corporate galas and slipping her into his life as if Eleanor were an afterthought. Cassandra reveled in her role, her laughter sharp and her gaze triumphant whenever she caught Eleanor's eye. She wore her status like a crown, her wardrobe a collection of silks and satins that screamed wealth and privilege. The tipping point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Eleanor, exhausted from a day of doctor's appointments, returned to their sprawling penthouse to find a pile of Cassandra's clothes strewn across the living room. Silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, and delicate lingerie, all reeking of her signature jasmine perfume. Victor stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping scotch, his back to her. "Wash them," he said without turning, his voice flat but laced with cruelty. "She's coming over tomorrow, and they need to be ready." Eleanor froze, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear but with a rising tide of disbelief. She was pregnant with his child, her body aching from the weight of it, and he was asking her to wash his mistress's clothes. The humiliation burned, a hot coal in her chest. She wanted to scream, to throw the clothes in his face, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned and walked away, her silence louder than any protest. In her bedroom, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. She thought of her mother, Vivian, a renowned fashion designer whose name was synonymous with elegance and defiance. Vivian had built her empire from nothing, her L. System, a scrappy seamstress's workshop in Paris, her creations worn by royalty and rebels alike. Eleanor hadn't told her mother about Victor's betrayal, not yet. She'd wanted to protect the illusion of her perfect life, but now the cracks were too wide to hide. She dialed Vivian's number, her voice breaking as she recounted the scene. Vivian's response was immediate and fierce. "Pack a bag. I'm coming to get you." Vivian arrived the next morning, a force of nature in a tailored black coat, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe chignon. At 60, she was as formidable as ever, her eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom that came from surviving a cutthroat industry. She took one look at Eleanor's pale face and the pile of Cassandra's clothes, still untouched, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "This ends now," she said, her voice low and dangerous. She didn't ask for details, she didn't need to. Vivian had seen men like Victor before, men who thought power gave them license to destroy. Victor was at the office, oblivious to the storm gathering at home. Vivian wasted no time. She marched to the living room, scooped up Cassandra's clothes, and carried them to the kitchen. Eleanor followed, her heart pounding. "What are you doing?" she asked, but Vivian didn't answer. She opened a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of bleach, and poured it over the pile of designer garments. The sharp scent filled the air as the colors began to fade, silk and cashmere dissolving into ruin. Then, with a flick of a lighter, Vivian set the pile ablaze in a metal basin, the flames licking hungrily at the fabric. Eleanor gasped, but Vivian's face was stone. "No one disrespects my daughter," she said, her voice steady as the fire crackled. The act was reckless, dangerous even, but it was Vivian's way, a declaration of war. Eleanor felt a mix of awe and fear. She'd always known her mother was fierce, but this was something else, a calculated destruction that spoke of a deeper pain. Vivian had fought her own battles, clawing her way to the top of the fashion world while raising Eleanor alone after her own husband's betrayal. This wasn't just about Cassandra's clothes, it was about every wound Vivian had ever borne, every fight she'd won. As the flames died down, Vivian turned to Eleanor. "You're not staying here another night," she said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. She felt broken but not defeated. Something stirred inside her, a spark of the strength she'd inherited from her mother. They packed a suitcase in silence, Eleanor's hands steadying as she folded her clothes. The nursery remained untouched, the tiny stars on the walls a painful reminder of what was at stake. But Eleanor knew one thing, she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. They drove to Vivian's Manhattan townhouse, a sleek fortress of minimalist luxury. Inside, Vivian poured them both tea, the delicate clink of porcelain the only sound for a moment. "He thinks he's untouchable," Vivian said, stirring honey into her cup. "But no one is." Her eyes gleamed with a plan, and Eleanor felt a shiver of anticipation. Vivian wasn't just a designer, she was a strategist, a woman who'd outmaneuvered countless rivals. And now, Victor was in her sights. Vivian's first call was to her lawyer, a shark named Marjorie who specialized in dismantling powerful men. "We're not just going for divorce," Vivian said into the phone, her voice crisp. "We're going for everything." Eleanor listened, her heart racing. She'd always known Victor's wealth was his armor, but Vivian saw it as his weakness. "His ego is his empire," Vivian told her later. "And empires fall when you pull the right threads." Over the next week, Vivian worked like a general marshalling an army. She called in favors from industry contacts, gathering evidence of Victor's financial indiscretions. There were offshore accounts, shady deals, and whispers of tax evasion, sloppy mistakes born of his arrogance. Eleanor, meanwhile, found her own resolve hardening. She wasn't just a victim, she was a woman with a legacy of strength. She began combing through Victor's emails, using passwords he'd never bothered to hide, and discovered a trail of correspondence with Cassandra that detailed their affair in blatant terms. Every word was a knife, but Eleanor wielded it like a weapon. Cassandra, for her part, was oblivious to the gathering storm. She strutted into Victor's office that week, expecting her freshly laundered wardrobe, only to find Victor distracted, his temper fraying. The news of the burned clothes hadn't reached him yet, but Eleanor had sent an anonymous tip to Cassandra's modeling agency, hinting at her unprofessional behavior. The agency, already wary of her diva reputation, began to distance itself. Cassandra's calls went unanswered, her bookings cancelled. She had no idea the real blow was yet to come. Vivian's next move was surgical. She leaked the emails to a tabloid known for its ruthless exposés, ensuring Victor's name was splashed across headlines. CEO's pregnant wife betrayed, Mistress's clothes destroyed in fiery revenge. The story was sensational, but Vivian ensured it was factual, every detail backed by evidence. The public devoured it, and Victor's board of directors began to panic. His empire, built on his image as a flawless leader, started to crack. Shareholders questioned his judgment, clients pulled contracts. Cassandra, humiliated by the spotlight, fled to a friend's apartment, her glamorous facade crumbling. Eleanor, watching the chaos unfold from Vivian's townhouse, felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Did we go too far? She asked her mother one night, cradling a cup of tea. Vivian's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. He went too far. You're protecting your future, and your son's. Eleanor nodded, her hand resting on her belly. She thought of the nursery, the stars, and the life she'd promised her child. She wouldn't let Victor take that away. Victor, meanwhile, was spiraling. He called Eleanor repeatedly, his voicemails a mix of anger and desperation. You're ruining me. He shouted in one, his voice slurred with scotch. You and that witch of a mother. But Eleanor didn't respond. She deleted each message, her heart stealing. Vivian, however, listened to one and laughed, a sharp, victorious sound. He's scared, she said. Good. The legal battle began in earnest. Marjorie filed for divorce, citing emotional abuse and infidelity, and demanded a settlement that included half of Victor's assets. The evidence of his financial misconduct, carefully curated by Vivian's contacts, gave them leverage. Victor's lawyers scrambled, but the damage was done. His reputation was in tatters, his mistress gone, and his empire teetering. Eleanor, once his silent partner, stood tall in court, her mother at her side, her belly a quiet testament to her strength. As the weeks passed, Eleanor began to rebuild. Vivian introduced her to designers and entrepreneurs, women who'd risen from ashes of their own. Eleanor started sketching again, her old passion for marketing reigniting. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Vivian, watching her daughter's transformation, smiled, a rare, genuine smile. You're my daughter, she said simply, and Eleanor felt the weight of those words, a crown of her own. Cassandra, meanwhile, faded into obscurity, her career crushed under the weight of scandal. Victor's empire didn't collapse entirely, but it was a shadow of its former self. He lived alone in his penthouse, the nursery empty, the stars on its walls a mocking reminder of what he'd lost. Eleanor, holding her newborn son months later, looked into his tiny face and saw a future free of Victor's shadow. Vivian, cradling her grandson, whispered, "We did it." And for the first time in months, Eleanor believed her. The air in the penthouse was thick with tension, a suffocating blend of betrayal and rage that clung to every surface like damp rot. Emily stood frozen in the doorway of the master bedroom, her swollen belly straining against the fabric of her worn cotton dress. Her hands trembled, clutching the laundry basket that held the silken garments of her husband's mistress, Vivian. The clothes were a mockery, each delicate lace camisole, each tailored skirt, a reminder of the life Daniel had chosen over their vows. The faint scent of Vivian's jasmine perfume wafted from the fabric, twisting Emily's stomach into knots. She was 7 months pregnant, her body aching from the weight of the child she carried, yet here she was, reduced to a servant in her own home, washing the clothes of the woman who had stolen her husband's affection. Daniel, the CEO of a sprawling tech empire, lounged on the leather sofa in the living room, his polished shoes propped on the glass coffee table. His tailored suit, a stark contrast to Emily's faded attire, screamed of the wealth he wielded like a weapon. He didn't even glance up from his phone as he barked the order that had become routine: make sure Vivian's things are spotless. She's got an event tonight. His voice was cold, detached, as if Emily were nothing more than hired help. The man she had married, the one who had once whispered promises of forever under starlit skies, was gone. In his place was a stranger who treated her like an inconvenience, her pregnancy a mere footnote in his glittering world. Emily's mother, Margaret, stood in the kitchen, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. A renowned fashion designer, Margaret had built an empire of her own, her name synonymous with elegance and power. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her tailored blazer a testament to her unyielding presence. She had arrived unannounced, her instincts screaming that something was wrong with her daughter. The sight of Emily, pale and hunched over a basket of another woman's clothes, confirmed her worst fears. Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line, her mind already spinning with plans. She had not clawed her way to the top of the fashion world by being soft. She was a woman who understood the art of war, especially when it came to protecting her own. Emily set the basket down, her hands shaking as she sorted through Vivian's clothes. Each piece was a dagger to her heart, custom made, exorbitantly priced, the kind of wardrobe Emily could only dream of now. She remembered the early days of her marriage, when Daniel had showered her with gifts, when he had looked at her with adoration. Now, he barely acknowledged her existence, except to issue demands. Vivian, with her sleek blonde hair and predatory smile, had swept into their lives 6 months ago, her presence like a poison seeping into every crack of their crumbling marriage. Emily had caught them together once, in Daniel's office, Vivian's laughter ringing out as she perched on his desk, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Emily had fled, humiliated, her tears ignored by the man who had sworn to cherish her. Margaret watched her daughter's hunched shoulders, the way her hands hesitated over the clothes, and felt a surge of fury. She had raised Emily to be strong, to never bow to anyone, yet here she was, broken by a man who didn't deserve her. Margaret's mind flashed to her own past. Decades ago, she had faced her own betrayal, a husband who thought he could diminish her. She had burned his world to the ground, metaphorically and financially, and emerged stronger. Now, she would do the same for her daughter. But this time, the destruction would be precise, surgical, and devastating. Emily moved to the washing machine, her movements mechanical. She poured detergent, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. The hum of the machine filled the silence, a low drone that matched the numbness spreading through her chest. She didn't notice Margaret slipping out of the kitchen, her phone already in hand, her voice low as she made calls to old contacts, lawyers, journalists, and industry insiders. Margaret knew Daniel's world better than he did. His tech empire relied on image, on the perception of invincibility. She would strip that away, piece by piece, until he was left with nothing but regret. As the washing machine churned, Emily sank to the floor, her hands resting on her belly. The baby kicked, a small flutter of life that reminded her why she endured this. She had no money of her own. Daniel had made sure of that, cutting her off from their joint accounts, claiming it was temporary, while his company navigated a merger. She was trapped, dependent on him for everything, her pride eroded with every task he forced upon her. Washing Vivian's clothes was just the latest humiliation, a deliberate act to remind her of her place. But the baby, her baby, was her anchor. She whispered promises to the child, vowing to find a way out, to give them both a better life. Margaret re-entered the room, her expression unreadable but her eyes blazing with purpose. She knelt beside Emily, her voice soft but firm. You don't have to do this, darling. You are not his servant. You are my daughter, and you are stronger than this. Emily shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I have nowhere to go, Mom. He controls everything. If I leave, I'll lose the baby. I can't afford to fight him. Margaret's hand tightened on Emily's shoulder, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. You won't fight him alone. I've already started the wheels turning. Trust me. Margaret's plan was already in motion. She had contacted a lawyer friend, a shark in the courtroom who specialized in high-profile divorces. She had also reached out to a journalist at a major outlet, one who owed her a favor from years ago when Margaret had tipped her off about a rival designer's scandal. The story of Daniel's infidelity, his cruelty to his pregnant wife, would be a bombshell, one that would tarnish his reputation and shake investor confidence in his company. But Margaret's true weapon was her own empire. As a fashion designer, she had connections in every corner of the elite world Daniel inhabited. She knew the wives of his board members, the influencers who shaped public opinion, the designers who dressed Vivian. She would use every one of them to dismantle Daniel's carefully curated life. That evening, Vivian arrived at the penthouse, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a predator stalking prey. She wore a crimson dress, one of Margaret's own designs, a fact that made Margaret's blood boil. Vivian smirked at Emily, who was still folding laundry, and tossed another pile of clothes onto the counter. These need to be done by tomorrow, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. And be careful with the silk, it's delicate. Emily's hands froze, her face burning with humiliation, but before she could respond, Margaret stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. Vivian, Margaret said, her voice smooth as velvet but laced with venom, you seem to have mistaken my daughter for someone who answers to you. Vivian's smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing. Mrs. Langston, this is none of your business. Daniel and I have an understanding. Margaret's smile was cold, predatory. Oh, I understand perfectly. But let me make something clear, you're wearing my design. Standing in my daughter's home, and you think you can dictate terms. You're about to learn how quickly the ground can shift beneath you. Vivian laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, but there was unease in her eyes. She turned to Daniel, who had entered the room, expecting him to defend her. But Daniel's attention was on his phone, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through messages. Margaret had already begun her work. Rumors were spreading, whispers of his infidelity leaking to the right ears. His board was asking questions, investors were growing uneasy, and a particularly damning email from an anonymous source Margaret's doing had just landed in his inbox, hinting at a financial irregularity in his company's books. Emily watched the exchange, her heart pounding. She had never seen her mother like this, a force of nature cloaked in elegance. Margaret's words were a lifeline, pulling her from the depths of her despair. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't as powerless as she thought. Maybe she could fight back. The next morning, the first cracks in Daniel's empire appeared. A headline in a major business journal questioned his leadership, citing personal conduct unbecoming of a CEO. Social media buzzed with speculation, fueled by carefully planted leaks. Vivian's event that evening, a high-profile gala, was overshadowed by whispers of her role as the other woman. The crimson dress, Margaret's design, was suddenly out of stock across every retailer, a quiet move by Margaret to ensure Vivian's moment in the spotlight was tainted. Margaret had also called in a favor with a rival designer, who, accidentally, let slip to a tabloid that Vivian had been blacklisted from their atelier for unprofessional behavior. Emily, meanwhile, was quietly packing a bag. Margaret had arranged for her to stay at a discreet apartment owned by a friend, a safe haven where she could rest and prepare for the birth of her child. The lawyer was already drafting divorce papers, leveraging Daniel's infidelity and financial control as grounds for a substantial settlement. Margaret had also ensured that Emily's medical expenses would be covered by a trust fund she had set up years ago, one Daniel knew nothing about. By the end of the week, Daniel's world was unraveling. His board called an emergency meeting, his stock prices dipped, and Vivian, sensing the tide turning, began distancing herself, her calls to him going unanswered. Emily, now settled in her new apartment, felt the weight of her humiliation lifting. She wasn't free yet, but she was no longer a prisoner. Margaret sat with her, sketching designs for a nursery, her presence a reminder that Emily was never alone. Daniel, alone in his penthouse, stared at the empty closet where Emily's clothes had once hung. The laundry basket, still filled with Vivian's garments, sat untouched. He had underestimated Emily, and more importantly, he had underestimated Margaret. The fashion designer had not just ruined his reputation, she had exposed his fragility, his dependence on the image he had crafted. As he scrolled through another article speculating about his downfall, he realized too late that the true cost of his betrayal was not just his marriage, but the empire he had built on lies. Emily, with her mother's fierce love and cunning, was rising, while he was left to face the ashes of his own making. https://www.youtube.com/watch. V equals 1K0K4 SIV16M